The Finnish guy, Eki, who was your data guy, did a lot of data work for you guys. He was amazed one time. It was at Barber. You were going into turn 1, and he and Don were on the wall, and you went into turn 1 in the race, and Eki was just shaking his head at Don and saying something like, "See, I told you, this is crazy." I said, "What are you guys talking about?" And he talked about how you will add throttle while you're braking into the turn to keep the back end from coming around. And you've never seen anybody else do that before.
Yeah, but for sure. This comes up a lot, and back in the mid-90s to late 90s, we really started seeing people backing the bikes into the corner. And, even some of the riders actually thought it was because they were using the rear brake. What actually happened was the bikes, the cranks got light on the bikes, the engines are at high RPMs, and when you're going into the turns, to get that rear wheel caught up with the same speed as the engine, it was just, you never had that as much inertia in the engines anymore, so it took a lot longer for the rear tyres to start getting, or the rear wheels to start getting caught up with the actual speed of the crank, when you started going down gears and stuff. So what actually happened was the rear wheel was just locking up a little bit, nothing to do with the back brake, and they were starting to step out. Same time, front tyre technology is getting better, forks are getting better, brakes are getting better, and all these things come into play, and in the end the back wheel's very, very light, it's skipping, it's moving out and that sort of stuff. To me, I'd never seen that as a positive. I always seen that as a negative to getting around a racetrack fast. Looked cool. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, it's fantastic. Looks great, when they're backing it in. Unfortunately, it just doesn't look that great when they're doing it for 5th place, So, as I said before, I've always been one of these old school guys that just thinks winning's great. The rest of it I sort of don't really care too much about.
You're so archaic.
Yeah, exactly. So I use the throttle and the clutch quite a bit to regulate and get that rear wheel up to speed with the crank and with the engine, and use the clutch and the throttle as I'm braking to keep that thing pulled in line. So, and it's something I've done a lot, and you can go back through as much footage as you like, you will rarely see me with the back wheel out of line with the front line.
Oh, yeah.
With the front wheel. And but it takes a lot of work, and it's very tiring. It's constant work into every corner where you're having that problem. And at some racetracks, there's a lot of corners where you're fighting to keep that back wheel in line, for sure. And that's just, to me, to get the back wheel out there as you're braking is not that big a deal. But to get that back wheel back in and turned into a corner, there's a lot of wasted time in that. When I'm talking a lot of wasted time, we might be talking a 10th or a 10th and a half a lap. But over 30 laps, I've won a race by 3 seconds over the guy that's doing that. Okay, so if he's doing everything else exactly the same as me, so I've always worked really, really hard on keeping 2 wheels in line. I believe that's the fastest way to go around a racetrack, is to keep them both in line on the entry and on the exit. So yeah, coming in the turns, hard brakes, a lot of clutch and a lot of throttle action, just trying to get that rear wheel caught up with the front, get that speed turning so that back wheel stays in line.
And downshifting, because you're downshifting.
Yep.
It just seems.
I do all my downshifting in one hit, always. Every corner, I downshift in one hit. So just all the way down. Then I regulate with the clutch and the throttle as to when I'm going to let that thing catch back up to speed. And by the time I get to the part of the turn where I'm really ready to start dropping in, I've got everything's in line, and I've got the wheel turning the same speed as the engine, and I can drop it in without any type of movement or anything else. So, yeah, lots of work.
Now back to at Road Atlanta, where it was Steve Rapp actually that pointed out to me how much later you would brake into turn 1 than everybody else. And I couldn't believe it. I just thought, Steve doesn't know what he's talking about. And so I paced it off, and it was 75 feet. I spent the whole race calculating it. It was, everybody else broke within the same 5 to 10 feet on the racetrack, and you were hell and gone into turn 1. When
ABS brakes.
ABS brakes.
Had to be something. We had something they didn't have. What was it that race?
They never caught you with those ABS brakes.
Yeah, I don't know. We must have been cheating in some form or fashion.
But I began to think and ask myself, I calculated it out, considering where you came out of the last turn, how much more speed you had because you were doing it in the previous turn, that it's just insurmountable, and you were winning the race by 15 or 16 seconds. That nobody can cope with that. Ben seemed to be the only person that could cope with that.
Yeah, and you know, Ben learnt how to ride the front of the motorbike, and there is no time to be made up on the rear end of a motorbike. As a matter of fact, when we rode the superbikes, motorbikes that were quite a bit harder to go fast on than the current motorbikes, when we raced those bikes, there were halfway through the race, you started coming up on lap riders who were riding more standard style super stock bikes or whatever. Most of the time it was very, very hard to accelerate past those guys, even though you had 20 horsepower more than most of them. Yeah. You just couldn't get the power down. You couldn't, there's just no time to be made up in that part of the racetrack, even against some guys that are 6 or 8 seconds lap slower than you. But all the times we made up on the front, all of it. Every single bit of, not every bit, but 95% of a racer's problems with not being able to go fast, the guys that are, when I talk races, I'm talking about guys that are within a second, that there is all on the front of the motorbike, all of it. Someone who can push the front tyre as hard as they can, the rear tyre, and get the thing to move as much, has got it hands down over most other people. And it's less predictable as well, so there's a much finer line between, in the rear the thing steps out, you give it a big handful, you can get the thing to spin up. The front's not like that. There's a fine line between.
So it's a more precarious way to make up time.
But I mean, it's the only way to make up time. You're not going to make up time setting up the rear of the bike to accelerate off a corner. You're just not going to do it. Maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Not much. It's not where it is. It's not the difference between the really fast guys and the next guys that are half a second off the pace. It's got nothing to do with the rear. Nothing at all.
Could you slide the front of the bike when you wanted to make it work around corners? I mean, did you?
No.
Because there are people who believe, like I told you at VIR, going into turn 4, that's the left, where you killed people in there all the time. There are people who think that you are intentionally losing the front, picking up the rear to get through that turn.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to sit here and say I was, that's skillful, but it's not the case. There are times, there were times with certain bikes, and probably more likely certain tyres, that pushing the front became something that, and feeling the front go and being able to pick it up, is not something you did intentionally, but you could do it and go whoop, and you could pick them back up. Most of the time, when you tuck the front bad enough, you ain't getting it back. But there were times throughout my career where certain tyres were much more forgiving than other tyres.
Okay.
But again, there's the difference between some people thinking they're on the edge on the front and the real edge of the front is very, very different. Very, very different. You think Rossi wins races by out accelerating people or whatever? No chance. Just has better feel on the front.